The wind moved across the Montana plains like a whisper from another life. Frank Dwyer stood in the doorway of his small cabin, a silhouette etched by the soft light of dawn. His hand, calloused and slow, reached up to the left side of his chest. Fingertips pressing gently where the old pain stirred deep metallic, almost forgotten yet never truly gone. 40 years. 40 years, and it still felt the same, like the edge of something sharp shifting beneath his ribs, reminding him that the war never ended. Not for him. Not really. The memento left behind in his chest, a 3-centimeter shard of shrapnel, had once been deemed harmless by field medics. Too risky to remove, they'd said. It's stable. Live with it. So he did. But lately, it didn't feel so stable. He winced as a throb pulsed behind his sternum, not searing but persistent, like the dull ache of memory. It had been growing louder these past weeks, in rhythm with the dreams, the jungle, the blood, the rain that never stopped falling in Quezon. And Jimmy. Always Jimmy. Inside, the floorboards creaked under his boots as he crossed to the worn kitchen table. A journal lay open, its pages scrawled with brief notes. 0302. Pressure. Radiates to back. 0303. Dull pain. Shortness of breath. Climbing stairs. 0304. Nightmare. Jimmy again. He closed it slowly, deliberately. Pain was a companion now, just another voice in the choir of ghosts. Frank lived alone and had for many years. The closest neighbor was a mile down the gravel road. He liked it that way. The noise of people was too much. He preferred the static of an old radio, the way it drifted in and out of signal like a memory trying to be forgotten. That morning, though, something shifted. As he poured himself coffee, black, bitter, undiluted, the pain seized him more tightly than usual. He dropped the mug. It shattered. He fell with it. Darkness folded around him. He awoke to white lights and antiseptic air. The ceiling above him was unfamiliar, clean fluorescent. A beeping nearby synced with his heartbeat. He tried to sit up, but a gentle hand pressed his shoulder. "Mr. Dwyer," a calm voice said. "You're in County General. You collapsed this morning. Do you remember?" He blinked. A woman stood over him, her coat identifying her as Dr. Elena Morales, Surgical Oncology. Her expression was firm, but not unkind. "There's something we need to discuss," she said. "Tests, scans." Words like encapsulation, fibrous tissue, and cardiac compression flowed past him like leaves in a current. But only one phrase stuck. "A tumor has developed around the shrapnel." He didn't speak. "It's likely benign." Dr. Morales continued, "But the growth is pressing against your heart and major vessels. If we don't intervene, it could lead to cardiac arrest." Still, he said nothing. "We recommend surgical removal. It's not without risks, but..." He shook his head. "Just once." "Definitive." Dr. Morales paused. "May I ask why?" Frank's voice, when it emerged, was rusted and low. "Because it's the last piece I have of him." The next day passed in silence. Outside his window, snow began to fall. Frank sat still in the hospital bed, staring not at the flurries but inward, down a long corridor of memory. February 1968. K. San. They had been on patrol when the mortars hit. Jimmy was hit first, thrown back by the blast. Frank remembered crawling toward him, deafened by the roar, dragging himself through mud and leaves. Jimmy's throat had been torn open, but his eyes were clear. But the sentence never finished. The shrapnel came next. Not that he remembered the moment, it was a blur of heat and light. All he knew was that when he woke up 3 days later in a field hospital, Jimmy was gone and something sharp had taken residence in his chest. He refused surgery, flatly. "If Jimmy's dead, I carry it. I carry all of it." The doctors had called it stubbornness. Maybe it was. Maybe it was guilt, or grief, or the desperate need for something to remain when everything else had been erased by fire and blood. He never married, never made peace with his son. Mark, now a man in his 30s, had stopped calling years ago. They had spoken last on the phone in clipped phrases and unfinished thoughts. "Why don't you ever talk about it? Because there's nothing left to say." That night, Frank dreamed again. He was in the jungle, alone, Rain fell in sheets. Then Jimmy appeared, not wounded, but whole, younger than Frank had ever seen him. His uniform was clean, untouched by blood. "You can let go," Jimmy whispered. "You're allowed." But Frank couldn't answer. His voice wouldn't come, and then Jimmy was gone. He awoke, gasping, hand pressed to his chest. The nurses found him in distress. Vitals unstable. He was transferred to the ICU. Back in his hospital room the next afternoon, Dr. Morales entered with a folder. "Mr. Dwyer," she said gently, "I know you've carried a great deal, but that burden doesn't need to define the rest of your life." She showed him the scan. A bright outline, the tumor wrapped tightly around the shrapnel like a clenched fist. "If you continue like this," she said, "it's not a matter of if, it's when." Frank stared at the image, then out the window. After a long pause, he said quietly, "If something happens during the surgery, I want you to mail this." He handed her a sealed envelope. No address on it, just a name, Mark Dwyer. That night, Frank recorded his voice on a small audio device. "Mark, I'm sorry. Not for the war, not for the silence, but for letting the war be louder than my love for you. I carried a piece of someone else for 40 years. Maybe now. I'm ready to come home. If this story moves something within you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We bring you real human stories of resilience, redemption, and silent courage. Let's walk this journey together." The silence of the hospital room was unlike any other silence Frank Dwyer had known. Not the tense hush before mortar fire, not the cold void of a midnight jungle. This was a silence that listened in expectant quiet. He sat in his hospital bed like a man stranded between decades, shoulders slumped, the sheet over his lap neatly folded by the hands of nurses who spoke kindly but did not know his story. Frank hadn't slept well, not in years, but now sleep eluded him like a cruel joke. Each time he closed his eyes, the past returned not as dreams, but as relived fragments. Kei-san. Blood in the rain. Jimmy's hand reaching, his eyes always open. He hadn't asked for this memory. It arrived uninvited like the smell of wet leaves before a storm. The night after his decision to allow the surgery, tentatively, fearfully, Frank began to wander. The nurses said later that he hadn't even seemed awake. He moved slowly down the corridor in his hospital gown, eyes glassy, one hand on the wall for balance. He made it as far as the end of the hall before collapsing. When they brought him back to the bed, he was muttering one name, over and over, Jimmy. Later that morning, a woman in a gray cardigan pulled up a chair beside him. She had no stethoscope, no white coat, only a gentle voice and a folder. "My name is Dr. Elena Morales," she said again. "I'm part of the surgical team but also trained in trauma support for veterans." Frank didn't respond. He watched the shadows shift on the floor. Night terrors, disassociation, emotional detachment. "These are common for those who've experienced combat trauma," she said softly. "It's not weakness, Mr. Dwyer. It's human." His jaw tightened. Still no words. I think she added, "You've been carrying too much alone." That afternoon, Frank requested a pen and paper. He didn't explain why. The nurses obliged. He began writing letters. They weren't addressed to anyone. Some were unfinished. Some were nothing more than a sentence or two. Most began with, "Dear Jimmy, I remember your laugh more than your voice. Isn't that strange? They said it was fast. I don't know. I just remember the blood. They gave me a medal, but I left it in a drawer somewhere. Felt heavier than it looked. The words didn't make it easier, but they made it real." One evening, while the sky outside darkened into early winter blue, Frank asked Dr. Morales about her father. She looked surprised, then nodded. "He was in the Gulf," she said. "Came back whole physically. But he didn't really come back at all." She told him about the years of silence, the sudden rage, the bottle hidden beneath the sink. He died of liver failure. The doctors wrote it as cirrhosis. Morales called it a casualty of war. Frank didn't say anything, but something in his eyes flickered. Recognition. 3 days before surgery, Frank's body began to betray him. His heart rhythm spiked. Blood pressure unstable. Dizziness, chest tightness. He vomited twice in one night, the nurses watching him with growing concern. The tumor was moving or growing. Either way, it was pressing harder now, clawing into vessels that had long ago given up protest. The pain became constant. Not unbearable, but insistent, like the drumbeat of footsteps behind him. He dreamed again, this time of the moment before the mortar. He was standing beside Jimmy, sharing a cigarette, talking about a girl back home. They laughed. The sun filtered through jungle leaves like cathedral light. Then the world turned white, and Frank awoke screaming. 2 days left. Dr. Morales sat beside him again, not with charts but a recording device. "You said you wanted to leave something," she reminded him gently. Frank stared at the machine for a long time. Then he leaned forward, pressed the record button, and began, "This is for my son Mark. If you're hearing this, it means I've finally let go. Not just of the shrapnel, but the silence. I wasn't a good father. I couldn't be. I was too full of ghosts. I never told you about Jimmy, or the jungle, or how I still smell iron every time it rains. That's not something you share over breakfast. But I wanted you to know that you were the one good thing that came after all the bad." He stopped, breathing heavy, then added, "I hope I wake up from this, but if I don't, please forgive me for not coming home sooner." The next day, a nurse brought in a small item wrapped in cloth, a necklace, a piece of broken glass, clear blue, the size of a thumbprint attached to a silver chain. Weathered, scratched. Jimmy's pendant. Frank had worn it for decades beneath his shirt, hidden from everyone. The chain had frayed. The clasp was gone. He held it in his hands for a long time before placing it into a small box on the nightstand beside the audio recorder. That night, something unexpected happened. Mark Dwyer arrived. He stood in the doorway of his father's room for a long moment before stepping inside. He looked older than Frank remembered. Broad shoulders, worn eyes. He carried no flowers, no expectation. "I got your message," he said quietly. "The doctor called. Said, you asked for me." Frank looked up from his bed. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. Mark didn't sit. He paced, hands in pockets. Then after several beats he said, "You know, I never hated you. I just didn't know you." No reply, and you made damn sure I couldn't try. Still silence. Finally, Mark sat in the chair, not close, but not far. Outside, the snow began to fall again. The morning of the surgery arrived cold and silent. Frank was prepped early. The surgical team reviewed every scan, every protocol. The tumor, now slightly larger than before, sat curled around the metal like a protective shell. Extraction would be difficult, but not impossible. As Frank was wheeled toward the OR, he caught Mark's gaze. Something passed between them, not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe the willingness for it. Inside the OR, the lights burned bright. Machines beeped. Monitors hummed. As the anesthesia took hold, Frank drifted not into unconsciousness but into memory. And there he was again in the jungle, barefoot, shirt torn. Jimmy stood before him, whole, smiling. "You've carried me long enough, Frank," he said gently. "It's time to walk on your own." Frank reached out, but Jimmy stepped back. "Tell our story," he said. "That's all I ever wanted." Then came the light. If this journey touches something in you, subscribe to our channel. We believe healing comes in stories, yours, mine, and even his. Let's share them together. The operating room was a cathedral of artificial light, clinical cold, unforgiving. Machines whispered in rhythmic patterns, monitors blinked in green pulses, and the stainless steel silence was broken only by the quiet rustle of gloves and murmured instructions. Beneath the bright surgical lamps, Frank Dwyer lay still, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical grace of a ventilator. Eyes closed, hands limp, heart struggling. Inside his chest, nestled in decades of scar tissue and fibrous growth, lay the remnant of a war long past. The tumor had claimed the shrapnel like a shrine, encasing it in a cocoon of pain and memory. Now, finally, it would be removed, but not without a cost. Chug. Outside the operating theater, Mark Dwyer sat in a hallway chair, elbows on his knees, hands clasped like a man praying without belief. He wasn't sure why he had come. Not really. Maybe because it had been too long. Maybe because the sound of his father's voice in that recording had cracked something inside him. The voice had been strained, but honest. A man stripped bare. Mark wasn't used to that version of Frank Dwyer. He remembered a childhood of measured silences and emotional absence. A father who watched baseball games in the dark, never said "I'm proud," never showed pictures of war, but flinched at the sound of thunder. But the man on that recording had said something Mark never expected to hear. You were the one good thing that came after all the bad. In the surgical suite, Dr. Elena Morales worked with deliberate focus. Her gloved hands moved with both caution and certainty, guiding her team through the layers of tissue toward the mass. The tumor was denser than anticipated, vascularized, fused to the pericardium in some places. "We need to separate it carefully," she murmured. "No damage to the atrium." And then, after what felt like hours, the moment arrived. Nestled inside the fibrous core was the object itself, dull, jagged metallic. A shard of war. They removed it in silence. No fanfare, no ceremony. Just hands and breath and history. Frank was not conscious for any of it. But somewhere deeper than flesh he stirred. Not in the hospital, not in the present. He was in a jungle again, but this time the light was soft. The trees glowed with golden haze leaves fluttering like silent applause. The air was warm, but not suffocating. He wasn't wounded. He stood, whole, curious, and then Jimmy appeared, younger, smiling, not the dying man from the battlefield, but the boy who once snuck cigarettes into boot camp, the friend who wrote home for Frank when words failed him. "You made it," Jimmy said, voice like sunlight on water. "I didn't think I would," Frank replied. "That's the thing about survival," Jimmy said. "It's not about staying alive. It's about coming back." Frank reached out and Jimmy took his hand, not in desperation, but in peace. "You don't need to carry me anymore," Jimmy said. "You never did." In the waiting room, Mark received the box. It was small, wooden, simple. Inside, the jagged piece of shrapnel rested atop a folded letter. No ribbon, no lock. He turned the box over in his hands, then opened the letter, his father's handwriting, sharp-practiced, slightly shaky. "Dear Mark, by the time you read this, I'll either be gone, or trying to find my way back to you. I don't know which is harder. I didn't talk about the war because I didn't know how to make it less awful. I didn't talk about love because I was afraid I didn't deserve it. But I remember the night you were born. I remember the way your hand fit in mine. And I remember thinking, this boy will never go where I went. I failed at a lot of things, but not loving you. Dad." The words blurred through tears Mark hadn't expected. He folded the letter gently and placed it back in the box. He held the shrapnel in his palm. Cold, weightless, yet heavier than anything he'd ever carried. Frank didn't wake the first night, or the second, but on the third morning as the nurses whispered and monitors held steady, his eyelids fluttered, his chest rose deeply, and then his eyes opened. Mark was there. He had fallen asleep in the chair, arms folded, head tilted sideways in exhaustion. Frank's voice, rough and dry, cracked through the silence. "Hey, kid." Mark jolted upright, blinking. They stared at each other for a long time. So much passed unspoken. Then Mark leaned forward. Voice low. "I read your letter." Frank nodded slightly. A pause. "I'm still angry," Mark admitted. "But I'm here." Frank looked at him, not with shame, but something closer to peace. "That's more than I ever expected," he rasped. The nurses called it a miracle of timing. Dr. Morales said it was the will to return, but in truth, it was something else entirely. It was the release of a burden finally laid down. Weeks later, Frank stood outside winter sun, warming the early spring frost. In his hand, a small glass jar. Inside it, the piece of metal that had nearly killed him and kept him alive. He walked to the edge of his son's backyard where a young oak tree had been planted. Beneath its roots, he dug a small hole, placed the jar inside and covered it with earth. No words, just breath. Beside him, Mark stood with his young daughter in his arms. "Is Grandpa burying treasure?" she asked. Frank chuckled, voice softer now. "No, sweetheart," he said. "Just something he doesn't need to carry anymore." Later that evening, Frank sat on the porch, warm blanket around his shoulders, a cup of tea in hand. The stars blinked above. Peaceful, familiar. He exhaled. For the first time in 40 years, the air went in and out without pain. He placed a hand over his chest. No pressure, no burn, just life. Healing doesn't always mean forgetting. Sometimes it means remembering the right way. If you believe in the quiet power of healing, subscribe now to our channel. Stories like Frank's deserve to be heard, remembered, and passed on. Healing is not a destination, it's a journey. Let's walk it together.